still seeing him standing here like a, well, maybe Eamon Andrews' sidekick. We're going to have the, it's a wee bit like This Is Your Life, but put your hands together for the man that he knows everything, Mr. Colin Cairney.
Thank you, Moz. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there seems to be something about this room and this time of year about me and presidents. Last year, when I'd done this for Brian, it had that famous one with Trump and Zelensky. And this time, Trump's obviously in more trouble at what he's doing. So hopefully next year might be a bit quieter. But I want to help celebrate the career of our new president. James Dunn Templeton McMillan, born in Glasgow on the 3rd of December 1945. That means our president celebrated his 80th birthday last December. But when I was speaking to him about this, he told me he's still working part-time at his local gun club. So I better say some nice things about him. A target on my back, yeah? So what have we got with us tonight, ladies and gentlemen? I think we have got Scottish Speedway royalty in our midst tonight. Not too many people in the room would argue, I think, we have the greatest living Scottish Speedway rider and probably the second most successful of all time behind the late, great Ken McKinley. I'll have some details to back up that claim to fame through the speech. However, given that one of Jimmy's middle names is Templeton, it should be no real surprise to us that he made the grade. Nephew of the formidable Doug and Willie Templeton, and of course the younger brother of Bill McMillan of Edinburgh, Glasgow and Berwick fame. Jimmy first attended the Speedway at Glasgow White City with his maternal grandfather to watch Uncle Dougie riding for the Tigers. Now, unfortunately, Speedway in Scotland in the early 50s was short-lived, with only sporadic non-league meetings taking place from the end of 1954 onwards. Therefore, it was not until the return of the Edinburgh to the Provincial League in 1960 at Old Meadowbank that saw the McMillan family returning to the Speedways, and Jimmy would often be seen in the pits spanning for his uncles and his brothers. And Jimmy followed his brother's return to Glasgow in 1964 at White City and took up the sport at the winter training schools held at Cowdenbeath in 1965-66. This being after he completed his apprenticeship as a sheet metal worker upon his dad's insistence, right? He wouldn't let you take up the Speedway career until you'd got a trade behind you. Yeah. So what about Jimmy's career? So he represented Scotland on 32 occasions. He represented Great Britain on 16 occasions. The English and British Touring Lions on 41 occasions. And the rest of world selects on 10 occasions. And of course, he combined that as well with his league career. And as I say, Jimmy started off in '66 at White City, and he made his debut for Glasgow Tigers in 1966, and we stayed with him at White City all the way through to the end of '68. He then moved with the Tigers to Hampden and had 4 good seasons there. In fact, 1970 and 71 were probably the pinnacle of Jimmy's league career, when both years he averaged over 10 points a match in British League. And bear in mind, this is a time when the likes of Barry Briggs, Ivan Major, Ole Olsen, Anders Michnick were all at their pomp. Ronnie Moore as well. So it was a hell of a job to get a 10-point average back then, and Jimmy done it on 2 occasions.
I wish. Well done, Brian.
And then he continued at Glasgow until they moved to Coatbridge in 1973, and still maintained a 9-point average then. But back then, I think Jimmy wanted to move south by that time, and the Tigers' licence was sold to Hull and Jimmy and Bobby Beaton became their spearhead when the Hull Vikings moved into the British League Division 1. And Jimmy obviously must have enjoyed it there at Hull, because his average shot back up to 9.7 in 74 and 75, so he was still a top class rider. Yeah. The end of 75, Jimmy took part in a rather strange triangular transfer that was arranged, and himself and the Swedish writer Tommy Johansson was supposed to move to Wolverhampton, and Ole Olsen was supposed to go in the opposite direction from Wolverhampton to Hull. But I don't think Olsen was having any of that, and he insisted that he wanted to go to Coventry. Tommy Johansson never turned out for Wolverhampton, so Jimmy was the only one that actually kept the word on that one, and you did move to Wolverhampton. For 5 good years at Wolverhampton, still a British League heat leader. Wolverhampton decided to move down from the First Division at the end of 1980. Mike Parker sold the licence to Dan McCormick, and he moved the Wolves into the Second Division. So Jimmy moved to Bellevue for 81 and 82. They're still holding about a 6-point average. At the end of 82, Jimmy decided perhaps British League Division 1 wasn't for anymore, and he moved back to the Tigers at Blantyre 2, where he raced there, and again credited a very good 9.84 average in his first year back. At the end of 83, he did a swap, just like he does tonight. Jimmy went to Berwick, and Brian went to Glasgow. And then you rode 3 years for Berwick, where you finished your career in 96, and still recorded an average over 7.5 at the end of 1986. So overall, looking at Jimmy's record, from 66 to 82 in the British League, over 585 matches, he averaged 8.27, 45 full maximums and 18 paid maximums. 83 to 86, when he was in the National League or Division 2, 158 matches, 8.63 average, 12 full maximums and 7 paid maximums. But overall, in total, you rode 743 matches. You went to the tapes 3,221 and scored 6,726 points. And £100 a point, that's so it gives you an overall average 8.35, 57 full maximums and 27 paid maximums. So over a 21 racing career, still be averaging over 8 points is some going, Jimmy. Major achievements in Jimmy's career, obviously you've got to say the 1972 World Individual Final, where Jimmy qualified as reserve. At the 1972 British Final, Jimmy finished equal 5th with Eric Buchak on 10 points. But there was only 5 places available from the British Final direct to the World Final. Therefore, a run-off is required for the final spot in the World Final. Jimmy was racing Eric Buchak in that run-off. Jimmy had beat Eric in Heat 18, but unfortunately in the run-off, Eric won it, and therefore Jimmy had to settle for the reserve spot on World Final night at Wembley. However, on World Final night, Barry Bryce gets injured in Heat 5, and therefore Jimmy at least gets to take 2 races and scores 2 points. He came out in Heat 10 and finished 3rd behind Christopher Lofquist and Nigel Buchak, but ahead of Eric Buchak. A pity you couldn't have done that in the run-off, but anyway, that was it. And then you appeared also in Heat 20 for another 3rd place. Ahead of John Louis won it, Anders Michanek 2nd, Jimmy was 3rd, and a chap called Kuzman from Russia finished. So at least you got 2 races in the World Final. You weren't just sitting in the pits awaiting. However, Jimmy also appeared in 3 World Pairs finals. So in total, he was a world finalist 4 times. In 1970, Scotland got to the final. It was Jimmy and Bear Harkins. And it's got a very credible 4th place with 18 points. Scotland's highest ever finish in a FIM event. In that match, Jimmy scored 10 plus 1 bonus and Bert scored 8 and 2 bonus.
Bravo.
Yeah.
Lovely.
He reached the World Peers final again in 1971, but this time with George Hunter, and it was a fifth place with 16 points. Jimmy scored 11 and George 5 and 2. But more importantly that year, in the semi-final, which was at Leicester, Scotland finished third to qualify for the final, and they scored 20 points, with Jimmy scoring 11 and 2 and George 9 and 3. Now, there was only 3 teams of each semi-final that qualified for the World Peers final, the 17th being the home nation for that time. And who did Scotland pick for the third place? England! Yay! Sorry, England finished with 19 points, 1 point behind the Scots, and they missed out. The important race being Heat 10, where Jimmy and George scored a 5-1 over Martin Ashby and Ray Wilson. So, in 1976, again in the World Peers final with George Hunter, 6th place this time with 12 points, Jimmy scoring 10 and George 2 and 1. So 4 world finals, so bear that in mind for later. So he also qualified for the British League Riders' Championship on 8 occasions, unfortunately missing out in 1970 through injury, although he worked top of the Tigers' average at the time. But in 1971 at Bellevue, Jimmy finishes equal second with Barry Briggs on 12 points, but loses a runoff and has to settle for third place behind Major and Briggs. But remember, these meetings at that time were often decided as harder than the World Final itself. And that year, the riders that were in this competition were Major, Briggs, Moore, Michenek, Olsen, the Bucock brothers, Wilson, Ide, Bentz, Janssen, and somebody called Harkins. So to finish equal second and just lose a run-off to Barry Briggs, I think is another testament to the levels that Jimmy got. Jimmy rode for Scotland in all 4 of the World Team Cup qualifying rounds in the 70s that Scotland took part in, and he scored a total of 18 points from 11 races. And I'm glad to say this year, in the last FIM that Scotland appeared in 1977, we have all 5 in attendance tonight. So there was Jimmy, Brian, Bert, Bobby, and Benny. It was, and it'll be 50 years next year since Scotland were last represented in the FIM. So I want to get a photograph later with you guys, and something I want to rub up Dick Barry with, but I'll tell you. Jimmy was also a regular competitor in the Scottish Open Championship. Unfortunately, he never won it. He wasn't the Scottish champion. But he did finish runner-up on 4 occasions and third once. And unfortunately, he finished second 3 times in succession to Ivan Major, 1971 to 73. Now, I did say to Jimmy that perhaps he should have told the Tigers promotion, give me Ivan's invitation and I'll hand deliver it, and it could have got lost in the post. But unfortunately it didn't. But there was a hell of a lot of people in the 70s that finished second to Ivan Major. So it's not, it's not a bad position. He was, however, Scottish Best Pairs champion with George Hunter in 1971. And also in his final year with Bellevue in 1982, Bellevue won the British League Division 1. And it was your only team award that you won in your career. To have it the last year, at least it gives them some silverware to. Now, Jimmy's final British League match was on the 4th of October 1982 at Reading, where he scored 4 + 2 from his 3 races. And his final British League heat win came at Coventry on the 25th of September 1982, winning Heat 2 ahead of Alf Bus, Peter Carr and Charlie McKenna, who I think is around there. Charlie came in last in that heat, but it wasn't a bad heat.
No change there.
Now, moving on to other notable events in Jimmy's career. As I say, Jimmy's name first appeared in the Tigers' second halves in April '66. So I think this must rank as the main sporting event of the summer of 1966. Did anything else happen in the summer of 1966? Barney or Rob from south of the border? No, so I think that was the big sporting event of 66 as far as we're concerned. Yeah. And he made rapid progress. That he made his Tigers debut on the 24th of June in the home match against Poole. His debut race being in Heat 4, and he picks up a third place ahead of Bruce Cribb. And then in Heat 8, he picks up a paid win behind his teammate Al Wells. But to be fair, both Wayne Briggs and Bruce Cribb failed to finish. So he got a paid win, and that ends up with 3+1 from 2 races, a very good debut. His first Tigers Heat win was achieved on the 5th of August 1966 in the home match against Wolverhampton. Jimmy wins Heat 8 in a time of 81 seconds, ahead of Dave Hemus, Johnny Fafeng and James Bond. So that's not bad, beating 007 to win your first race. Or was it James Bond or was it Mike? Right here, standing in for him. Now, Jimmy made such an impression in his first season in 1966. Wait a minute, I have to do a little bit of electronics here, bear with me. And to mark Jimmy's image, Martha Reeves and the Vandellas brought out the song called Jimmy Mac. Well, now you're coming back. So there you go. Now, that reached number 20 in the British charts. So is your family buying a lot of records?
Still got them.
So that's not bad, is it? You have a song named after you. Now, Jimmy's first Tigers maximum comes on the 12th of April 1968 in the home match versus Leicester at White City. Against riders of calibre Ray Wilson, Anders Michnik and John Bulger. And that was the season that really Jimmy made his mark in the sport. He served his apprenticeship in 66 and 67, but when Tigers were quite weak in 68 after Charlie Monk moved to Sheffield, they didn't really have a number 1. But upstepped young Jimmy and raised his average to over 8. So I think you must have enjoyed yourself at White City that season. You really came to fore in the sport. Unfortunately, of course, Tigers then left White City at the end of that season and they moved to Hampden. And Jimmy does very well there, as we'll come along to. Jimmy gained his first Great Britain cap at Coke Bridge on the 22nd of June 1968 in the Test match versus Sweden. But it was a bit of a disaster for the British team, lost 37-71. But Jimmy acquitted himself well, being GB's second top scorer with 7+1 from 6 races, including a Heat 7 win ahead of Ovi Fundin, Toby Harrison and Charlie Monk. So, well done again, Jimmy, for that. And Jimmy gains his first Scottish cap at Coke Bridge on the 31st of August 68 in the international against England. A Scottish win by 62-46, and Jimmy scores 10+2 from 6 races. He captained Scotland for the first time at Hampden in 19th September 69 in a test match against Norway, scoring 16 points in a Scottish win. Now at that time as well, Jimmy was a regular tourist to Australia for the British Winters, his first trip being in the 68-69 Winter Test Series, where he represented the English touring lines, along with famous other Sassenachs, McKinley, Hunter and Harkins. So half this English team was actually Scottish. And it wasn't until the 73-74 tour that the name changed to the British Lions, and Jimmy and George Hunter helped the GB win the series 6-1 in Australia. Jimmy was the first challenger of the revamped Golden Helmet in the 1970 season. Ivan Major was nominated the holder, having held the Silver Sash at the end of the 69 season. And Jimmy top scored for Glasgow at Bellevue on the 28th of March 1970, and therefore earned the right to race Ivan. But guess what? Ivan won again. Now, such was Jimmy's form in the early 70s. He was a regular fixture in the GB test team. And it was during a GB tour of Sweden that Jimmy broke his leg in the second test on the 4th of October 1970 in a collision with Bent Janssen after Jimmy's bike had failed. This was very unfortunate. He was in such a rich vein of form, having scored 15 points in the first test match. However, he was a quick healer, and he was back in action in early January 71 in Australia. And some other different things about Jimmy's career, but some closer to home. Jimmy appeared at Murrayfield Ice Rink in Edinburgh on the 27th of February 1972, racing for the Air Giants, doing very well on a very strange surface and strange bikes to score 13 points from 5 races. Jimmy also appeared twice at the long track events held at Motherwell Raceway, and in fact he won the Champion of Champions event on the 7th of May 1972, and a field that day were also Harry McLean and Bert Harkins. Long track as well, you turned your hand to do. So, at the end of 1972 season, Jimmy's name will go down in history as the fastest ever man around Hampden Park. And the track record being 71.8 seconds on the 15th of July 1971, and obviously that will never be beaten. Oh well, very good. And you were also the track record holder when the Tigers left Coatbridge in the First Division in 1973. But the track was subsequently resized, so you weren't the track record when the track closed, but you were when it ceased being First Division. Now, how many in the room remember Jimmy McMillan, the pop star? Yeah? In 1973, a group was formed called The Rivals, and they recorded a Speedway song called Speedway, and there was 13 riders in it, including George Hunter and Bert Harkins. And here is a photograph to prove it. And I'll pass it around the room so you can all see it, but I was wondering, could Jimmy and Bert maybe give us a rendition? Can you remember the words?
Let's go, Jimmy. All word was Speedway, Speedway, that was it. Can I just say something, Colin?
Yeah.
That when we did that recording at Decca Studios in London, we're doing rehearsals, and then the producer behind the glass screen, he said, stop. He said, can the Scottish guys keep their voices down? Drowning out all the others. They need to keep quiet.
Also in 1973, whilst at Coatbridge, Jimmy had a fan club run by a Miss Doris Ray of 38 Scarborough Drive, Eastwood, Glasgow, and the membership fee was 25 pence. Can you remember what did they get for the 25 pence? It was a sign for an evening with Jimmy McMillan. In 1979, he also took part in indoor speedway at Wembley at the arena, and he scored second place in the ladder indoor international behind Ivan Major. Again, he also competed at Wembley Arena in 1980 and 81, and also at the Birmingham Exhibition Centre in 1980, finishing 4th in the Grand Prix event. So another feather to his bow in this indoor speedway lark. So wonder if it'll ever catch up. So, in 1983, when Jimmy was back at Glasgow, he represented the Tigers in the National League pairs at Bellevue with Steve Lawson as his teammate. And Jimmy won all of his qualifying heats and the semi-final to take Glasgow into the final to face Weymouth, who were represented by Martin Yates and Simon Cross. Jimmy is leading till the final bend of the final when disaster struck in the form of a puncture, allowing Yates through to take the win ahead of Jimmy and Steve. Now, nowadays that would have been enough to secure the title under the 4-3-2-0 scoring, but back then it was 3-2-1-0, and the heat winner trumped the second and third finishes, so Jimmy and Steve had to settle for runners-up. But for that one puncture. However, Jimmy did hold the silver helmet, the National League silver helmet, in 1985. He relieved Ian Barney of the crown and successfully defended it against Mike Spink at Canterbury and Gordon Kennett at Eastbourne. You heard of him at all? Yeah. Yes.
I've heard about it.
Yeah. So Jimmy became the 85-86 winter holder of the silver helmet, therefore giving Jimmy plenty of time to polish his helmet during the winter. Unfortunately, he lost out on the first defence in 1986 to Colin Richardson at Eastbourne. Jimmy's final Speedway match took place at Boston on the 5th of October 1986, representing Berwick Bandits. His final race being Heat 12 with the finishing order of Kevin Jolly, Jimmy McMillan, Dave Jackson and Steve McDermott. Jimmy returned to the Murrayfield Ice on the 15th of February 1987, racing for the Scotland Select in a 14 tournament. And also in the 90s he took part in various Barry Briggs Golden Great events, one at Powder Hall and one at various places. Good to see some of the old guys making it. After hanging up his leathers, Jimmy performed team manager roles for Berwick, Glasgow and Stoke, and also became the technical advisor for the FIM, which took him all over Europe, including ice racing in Russia and Finland. And Jimmy eventually retired from Speedway duties in 2020. I'm also told though that Jimmy ran a cycle shop in Helensburgh around about that time. And so another feather to your bow. Now, I said earlier that Jimmy is probably the second most successful Scottish speedway of all time. But as a Monarchs fan, I also believe tonight we have the Tiger's GOAT with us. That is the Tiger's greatest of all time. I know there's a number of names in the frame. Tommy Miller in the 50s, Charlie Monk in the 60s and 70s, Steve Lawson in the 70s and 80s, Shane Parker in the 2000s and Chris Harris of the modern era. But only Jimmy and Charlie performed in the top division of British Speedway, representing the Tigers, and both recorded 10 points averages on 2 occasions with the Tigers. But I think Jimmy's world final appearance just clinches it for him. So I hope we all agree. I think we've also got Tigers' greatest of all time with us tonight. So in closing, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to give you our Scottish Speedway Radio Association's President for 2026, Jimmy McMillan. Thank you, Moz.